So the title of this class is Daniel, the Key to Bible Prophecy. So if you try to understand the Old Testament, you really can't understand the book of Revelation and God's plan without really understanding Daniel. Daniel is like the key that opens the door to understanding God's plan for redemption. And within the book of Daniel is the 70 weeks of Daniel, and that 70 weeks of Daniel is the blueprint of God's plan. But all throughout the book of Daniel, God puts the blueprint down. God implants, and he maps out the plan and the events that are going to take place in the end times and the redemption of Christ and eternal life and redemption. So this is the handout that everybody should got. So we're going to start out with an introduction to the book of Daniel, just for everybody here. So the book of Daniel connects the Old and the New Testaments. Jesus himself quotes from the book of Daniel, Matthew 24:15, and he says, Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation as spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. One of the major themes of the book of Daniel is that God is in control of the nations. God knows everything that's going on. There's no hidden events taking place, and God's in control of time. And we see this through the timeline of the Messiah. One of the most amazing parts of the book of Daniel is God gives us the exact day and the exact year that Jesus Christ, the Messiah, is going to die for the sins of the world. And that's in Daniel chapter 9, known as the 70 weeks of Daniel. And within that, God establishes a blueprint for Bible prophecy. So, and the book of Daniel is so powerful, so accurate historically, that it's a target of critics because of its prophecy and the accuracy of its prophecy. And the reason it's a target is because people who don't believe the Bible could be true and don't believe in the supernatural have a hard time accepting the book of Daniel because it's so detailed in its historical content. It's so detailed in the events that someone who's an anti-supernaturalist, someone who believes that the supernatural is impossible, they just cannot accept the book of Daniel. It's like they have to try to discredit the book of Daniel. One of the areas to understand as it's in the timeline of events is the kingdoms of this world. Like one of the themes of Daniel is God is in control of the kingdoms of this world. And so we begin the book of Daniel in a period of conflict in the Middle East. Something new, a period of conflict in the Middle East. The conflict of the major kingdoms involved are going to be Assyria and Egypt and Babylon. So if you look on your handout, so Egypt is where Egypt is today. Assyria is where Iraq is, where you see the Tigris and Euphrates River, okay? And then Babylon is north of the bottom part of Iraq. Assyria is on the north, Babylon's on the south of that map. What was happening is just like today, we have conflicts between nations. When we see this going on in the Middle East with Iran, with Iraq, with Syria, with Israel, with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. If you just follow the news, you'll see all these nations are in conflict. So it was very similar to the kind of a situation back then, except Egypt was a major player along with Assyria. Syria is north of Babylon. So but what happened is that, and Israel was also a part of this conflict, but Israel was like the less powerful of the kingdoms. So Israel always looked to other nations for alliances, just like they're doing today. Josiah was the king of Israel, and he tried to stop the Egyptians as they were involved in this conflict, and Josiah got killed. And Josiah was one of the most righteous kings in Israel's history. And so what happens is Nebuchadnezzar is the general of the Babylonian forces that are opposed to Assyria to the north and opposed to Egypt to the south of Israel. And so Egypt and Assyria are teaming up against Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar is the general. His father is Nebuchadnezzar, and he's the king of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar defeats the kingdoms of Assyria and defeats the kingdoms of Egypt, and as a result, Babylon becomes the major player. But what happens in the same time that Nebuchadnezzar defeats them, his father Nebuchadnezzar dies. And so Babylon then takes possession of Israel, and Israel's being ruled by a king named Jehoiakim, who was appointed by Egypt. And so then Babylon asserts its authority, and Jehoiakim submits to Babylonian authority, and this kind of begins the beginning of Daniel chapter 1. One of the things that's important to understand is during this period of time, what was called Josiah's revival. If you go to page 2 of the introduction, okay, you'll see Josiah's revival. And it's during this time, basically, people forgot about the law. The law wasn't really being followed, and God was actually judging the nation of Judah because of their sins. And so Josiah was king. He became king at 8 years old. And when he became king at 8 years old, he was under the priests. And then when he was 18, okay, Hilkiah found the book of the law. And when they found the book of the law, the Torah, there was a revival that took place because Josiah, as leader, says, we're not following this book of the law. And so he basically started reading, and he started realizing all the sins that the nation was involved in. And so Josiah then implemented the law. He then destroyed all the idols. He destroyed all the places of idol worship and so forth. He implemented the law for the nation. And this was called Josiah's revival. And it's during this period of time, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah are all alive. They're all three are alive at the same time. These are three major prophets in the land of Israel, or Judah, because Judah is the southern kingdom, Israel's the northern kingdom. And so Jeremiah is about 30 years old at this time. Ezekiel is probably in his 20s, 25, and Daniel's probably about 14 or 15 years old at this time. And so Josiah has a national Passover, and so there's a revival in the land. But it's actually too late because the people are so corrupted that God's going to judge the nation. We'll see more about that in Daniel chapter 1. But it's important to understand that the authorship of the book of Daniel is attested to by none other than Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So what is Jesus saying? Jesus is giving authority to the book of Daniel. That's right. He's giving authority. He's recognizing the book of Daniel as being written by Daniel. So any critics of the book of Daniel, their debate is not with me. Their debate is with Jesus, okay? Because Jesus attests to the book of Daniel. Also in Daniel chapter 12, verses 4 and 9, the book of Daniel is dated to what's known as the abomination of desolation by the critics. There's a guy named Porphyry, okay, in the 3rd century AD. And so because Daniel was such a powerful and accurate book, Porphyry and other critics said that the book of Daniel was late dated. And that's the main conflict with the book of Daniel, because some want to say, well, there's no way that the book of Daniel could have been written when Daniel lived because it's so accurate historically, because it talks about the abomination of desolation, which is where we get Hanukkah. So, but Jesus also mentions the abomination of desolation, but Jesus mentions it in a future tense. You're going to see why that's so important to understand the context of the book of Daniel, because the abomination of desolation took place in 167 BC, and the late critics say, well, it took place in 167 BC, and the 11th chapter of Daniel actually describes the abomination of desolation. So they say, well, there's no way it could have been written before the abomination of desolation took place. But the book of Daniel also gives us the exact day and the exact month that Jesus Christ is going to die on the cross. And that was written 539 BC, okay? So that's the powerful thing in understanding in the book of Daniel. And so we have an early date. And how can we confirm this early date? We can confirm this early date through archaeology. The things that Daniel talks about and the things that Daniel describes are confirmed in archaeology. Just think how hard it would be for you and I to describe something that took place 500 years. Like the late date for the book of Daniel is during the life of Daniel, which is about from 605 BC to 530 BC. That's the early date. That's when Daniel was written. The people who say it was written later, they're under the opinion that somehow that the writers were so well of the historical events that were taking place that they could actually try to make it up and put it into a context in which a period outside of their time. But Daniel is so accurate historically that there's no way that can be done. So, for example, this is Tiglath-Pileser, okay? He lived 745 to 727 BC, and he's mentioned in 2 Kings 15 verse 29. If you look on the last, I think it's the last page of your handout here, is the tomb of Daniel. So you can actually go to Iran today. You could actually go and visit the tomb of Daniel. So who would like to go visit the tomb of Daniel? Okay, it's in Iran. Okay, so you're going to take a little bit of risk, but the promise to Daniel in Daniel chapter 12, verse 13 says, Daniel, go your way, you shall awake to your inheritance at the end of days. And so there is a tomb of Daniel waiting for Daniel to awake to his inheritance. So both Jews recognize the prophet Daniel, Christians recognize the prophet Daniel, even the Muslims recognize the prophet Daniel. But again, one of the main themes of the book of Daniel is that God rules over the nations. Now, another unique characteristic of the book of Daniel is that it's actually written in two languages, okay? The book of Daniel is written in Hebrew and Aramaic. So if you open up the book of Daniel and you read Daniel chapters 1 and Daniel chapters 2, okay, it's written in Hebrew, but there's a certain point where Daniel switches over to Aramaic, and it ends at Daniel chapter 7:28 is the last chapter in Aramaic, and the rest is written in Hebrew. And the reason for that is that Daniel is written to both audiences. Daniel's written to a Gentile audience, and it's written to the Jewish audience. So, and if you want to see Aramaic, all you have to do is look at the current Hebrew alphabet. The current Hebrew alphabet is actually Aramaic. Because when the Jews returned from Babylon, they could no longer read their ancient script because they all were returning. It was 70 years later, so the kids grew up not reading the ancient script. They ended up using the Babylonians, the Aramaic script. And so what did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah, rather than having people not being able to read the Bible, they changed the script from the ancient, what's called Paleo-Hebraic script, to the current Aramaic script. And even the book of Daniel, the middle portion of the book of Daniel, is written in Aramaic. So that's an important thing to understand, the two languages in the book of Daniel. And there's a couple of portions in Esther that are also written in Aramaic. And another important feature to understand in the book of Daniel is what's called the divisions of the book of Daniel. So if you open up the book of Daniel and you look at Daniel chapters 1 through Daniel chapter 6 is historical in content. It includes Bible prophecy, like chapter 2 is a very powerful prophecy, but the main portion, Daniel chapters 1 through 6, is historical. And Daniel's chapters 7 through 12 are prophetic. And chapter 11 is probably the most detailed prophecy in the whole Bible that gets into the events, even some of the events that are taking place today, okay? And that's an important chapter to understand. And another area of understanding is what's called the apocryphal. So if you're from a Catholic or Orthodox background and you open up the book of Daniel, you would see that the book of Daniel in the Protestant Bible has 12 chapters, but the book of Daniel in a Catholic Bible actually has 14 chapters. So there's a couple of additional chapters that are in the book of Daniel, or 3 chapters that are additional. So Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, and the Prayer of Azarias, but those aren't in the Hebrew Bible. Those are just in the Catholic Bible, Orthodox Bibles, and so forth. And they're put in there, they're included in there from the Greek translations, but they're not in the Hebrew Bible and they're not in the Protestant Bibles. And so one of the main reasons, and if you look on the last couple of pages of the handout, one of the main areas, the 6th criticism of the book of Daniel, okay, it's the rejection of canon, okay, which is, the word canon means straight line, okay, as opposed to a cannon that fires a artillery round, okay. So the rejection of the canoncy, okay. So I really personally, I says, if Jesus quotes from the book of Daniel, to me that ends the argument. You know, it's like Jesus says, Daniel is canon, I'm going to actually quote from it. So therefore, when you see the abomination written by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So Jesus is telling you that he accepts the book of Daniel, just like Jesus also accepts Noah. As in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man returns. So Jesus affirms Noah, he affirms Daniel, okay? But again, the canoncy of the book of Daniel, it's included in what's called the writings. So the Jewish Bible has a tripartite division. It's called the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah. Then the prophets, okay, the Ketubim, okay, and then the writings. So the 3 writings. And so that's where you hear the word Tanakh, okay, Tanakh, okay, Torah, Nahibim, the prophets, and the Ketubim, the writings. So Daniel is included in the Jewish Bible in the third part of that division under the writings, not under the prophets. So that's one of the criticisms that people have in the book of Daniel. But Daniel was a prophet. Jesus attests him being a prophet. And then the next area of rejection of the book of Daniel is because Daniel is so, I'm on page 5 of the introduction page, in the introduction. So Daniel is so detailed in its historical accuracy that people have a hard time accepting that as accurate. We'll get more into the details there. But again, the book of Daniel, for example, if you read the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel, it actually says, and talks about the rebuilding of the second temple, okay? And then it says, after the Messiah is cut off, the people, the princes who come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That happened in AD 70. So again, that was written way before even the late date. It's written way before the late date, okay? And so, but the book of Daniel actually has lots of details in the archaeology that are affirmed in the words. For example, if you were to use a word today, and let's say, for example, if you use the word howdy, okay? Very colloquial word, and every word has origins, and you can actually break down the etymologies of words. So when we go into the book of Daniel, we know that the etymologies, the origin of the words in the book of Daniel actually date to the period of time in which Daniel lived. We can examine that archaeology. And just like the word, if I said the word howdy, you would say that there's an origin. You can actually trace the origin of different words. And so in the same way, the book of Daniel, we can affirm the book of Daniel because of the words that in the language. So the other area in the book of Daniel is that people might criticize is historical inaccuracies. And this exactly is Nabonidus Chronicle, I think. And so the Nabonidus Chronicle, the cool thing about this is people would say that there is no record of an individual. Let's say, for example, in Daniel chapter 5, that when you see the handwriting on the wall, okay, and it talks about a king, and there was no record of this king. They couldn't find a record of this king anywhere. And they say, well, the book of Daniel is wrong because they can't find a record of this king. And so then archaeologists find what's called the Nabonidus Chronicle. Nabonidus was the father of Belshazzar, who's the king in Daniel chapter 5. So then this explains what happened, that Nabonidus, he left his kingdom, he left the capital of Babylon, and he was starting another city called Tema, and in the city of Tema, he had basically changed the god of Babylon to a different god, and he installed his son, Belshazzar, as king of Babylon. So that's why when they offer Daniel the third position in the kingdom, it's going along with the archaeological record that Nabonidus was the father, his son Belshazzar was installed as secondary ruler of Babylon, and so when they said Daniel was going to be offered third ruler, it went along with what the Nabonidus Chronicle told us about that. And so again, that the archaeology proved the historical accuracy of the book of Daniel as opposed to the critics' charge that there was no Belshazzar. So archaeology proved there was a Belshazzar, and he was the son of Nabonidus, and he was the second ruler, not the first ruler, because his father was the first ruler. And so that's a quick introduction. You have a handout in your introduction, okay? And the last page of the handouts is a timeline. You have to squint to read that. But a breaking down of the timeline. Let me get into chapter 1 of Daniel, okay? So in chapter 1, basically starts out in 605 BC. So 605 BC is a little more than 2,700 years ago, okay? In 605 BC, Jehoiakim is king, okay? He's king, and what happens is the Babylonians come, and the Babylonians reassert his authority, and Jehoiakim gives his allegiance to the king of Babylon. He was allied with Egypt, now he's allied with Babylon. And why is this happening? Why is Israel falling to the Babylonians? It's because of the sin of what's going on in Judah, the sin that's taking place. And so prior to Judah falling, there was a northern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 BC. So about 118 years earlier, the northern kingdom, and you remember there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was when Israel fell away. There was the 10 tribes of the north, and Judah and Benjamin were the kingdoms of the south, okay? And so now God was judging Judah in the south, okay? And so we see this, if you look in your handout, Jeremiah was actually, so you want to understand a good breakdown is Jeremiah was in Jerusalem while this was taking place. Daniel is going to be taken as a captive to the land of Babylon. And Ezekiel and Jeremiah are both in Jerusalem at this time. But Jeremiah is our eyewitness about the conditions of the land at this point. So if you read Jeremiah chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and I'll just read it. It says, "Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. See now and know, and seek in her open places, if you can find a man. If there's anyone who execute judgment, who seeks the truth, and I will pardon her. Though they say, as the Lord lives, surely they swear falsely." So what happened is Israel, or Judah, the southern kingdom, had fallen away from the Lord. They had a lot of what's called God talk. So that's where it says that though they say, as the Lord lives, surely they swear falsely. So, and by the way, this is the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. It was taken to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany by the archaeologists in the 1800s, and it was reassembled. But this, Daniel would have seen this very gate in Babylon. The people are corrupted. And so that's why God tells Jeremiah, go through the city, okay? And seek in her open places. If you can find a man, if anyone who executes judgment, who seeks the truth, I will pardon the city. So that was God's challenge to Jeremiah, but it was an illustration of the incredible sin that was taking place. And so Jeremiah then says, "How shall I pardon?" For God, Jeremiah quotes, "How shall I pardon you for this? Your children have forsaken me and sworn by those that are not God's. When I fed them to the full, they committed adultery and assembled themselves by troops in harlots' houses. They were like well-fed, lusty stallions. Everyone neighed after his neighbor's wife. Shall I not punish them for these things, says the Lord? And shall I not avenge myself on such a nation as this?" So this was the state of the nation. The nation was corrupted. It had turned away from the Lord. It was involved in a lot of sexual immorality that was taking place. All the things they had completely turned away from the Lord. And so it was actually part of the promise in Deuteronomy. It says, if you obey me, you're going to be the chief nation on the earth. You're going to be the head and not the tail. That's Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 to 5. But it says, if you turn away and you follow after other gods, you're going to be scattered amongst the nations, and in the day, you're going to wish it was night, and at night, you're going to wish it was day. You're going to be pursued. You're going to be hunted down. And so God, that was the covenant promise in Deuteronomy chapter 28. And so God was going to usher in the promises of judgment on the nation of Israel because they had turned away and they had abandoned their covenant. So by doing that, they had then brought about the judgment that was going to take place in the time of Daniel. So this event is known as the first. Daniel is actually taken into Babylon during what's called the first captivity. The Babylonians end up coming back to Jerusalem 3 times. The first time they come is in 605 BC. 605 BC, that's when Daniel is taken captive into Babylon. Along with Daniel being taken captive into Babylon, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also being taken captive into Babylon. So during this time, Egypt was defeated at the Battle of Carchemish, and we talked about that in the introduction, and Nebuchadnezzar now has to return to Babylon because his father, Nebuchadnezzar, dies. And so to try to get Jerusalem to submit to his authority and to behave, he takes hostages. And Daniel is one of the 4 hostages. There's more than these, but these are the 4 hostages. It's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken into Babylonian captivity. And so that's who they are. They're actually, Daniel and his 3 friends are actually all descendants of King David. They're all of the royal line of David. So if you look in the handout, okay, Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 2 kind of breaks down the time period. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And notice what it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure of the house of his God. The first thing to recognize, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. So that's 605 BC is the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. And so there's some controversy with this because some people will criticize the book of Daniel because they would say it was taking place in the 2nd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. The 4th year of the reign of Jehoiakim, because according to the Babylonians kept an accounting of the king, the 1st year of a king's ascension he's not really considered king. That was a year of his ascension, and it wasn't considered part of the timing. And so Jehoiakim actually came to power a year early. So Daniel uses the Babylonian accounting system in this chapter. So the second point to understand here, okay, is that Nebuchadnezzar is king of Babylon. He comes to power as king of Babylon. So notice one of the things that takes place here is that it says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God. So why do you think the Lord would give Jehoiakim into his hand? As it was, Jehoiakim, the kingdom didn't fall because it fell on its own. It fell because the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hands, along with some of the house of the articles, some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into Shinar. Shinar is like we're between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. Okay, that's where it's called Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers. Meso meaning middle, Potamia meaning rivers, the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's where Shinar, land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And so they brought the very articles from the temple in Jerusalem to the land of Shinar. And so, but that was because God was judging Judah. And later in Jeremiah chapter 25, God actually says Nebuchadnezzar is a servant of God, because Nebuchadnezzar is an instrument of God's judgment against the land. So that's where Daniel is then taken hostage, along with the articles of the house of God, which are taken into Babylon. Daniel chapter 1, verse 3 says, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. So here's one important point that's taking place. You have to understand Daniel. Daniel is probably about 14 years old at this point. And one of the things I always ask myself is how could a 14-year-old boy, Daniel, he goes into imagine your son, your child at 14 being taken into a foreign land, completely pagan land. And the purpose of this is that the king of Babylon is going to indoctrinate these kids, and they're going to be basically reinstalled in Jerusalem in the future. And they're going to have Babylonian indoctrination, okay? And so what we see here is that Daniel Daniel sets an example for everybody. Like, how could this young boy at 14 be taken into a foreign land and go through this indoctrination process and come out as leader? Because we're going to see later is that it says in Daniel chapter 10, when the angel sees Daniel, he says, Daniel, from the first day that you set your heart to understand and know your God, your words were heard. So Daniel was different in the sense that Daniel wasn't like the rest of Judah, is that Daniel sought after the Lord and he put his faith in the Lord. And God heard him. It says from the very first day that you set your heart to understand. So that being the case, Daniel is marched back into Babylon along with Nebuchadnezzar, who goes there. They're hostages along with everything else. And then in verse 3, Daniel 1:3, it says, then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. Okay, so that was the purpose. Now, so these kids were going to be indoctrinated. They were going to be trained, okay, along with everybody else. So notice it says Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs. That's one of the arguments that which Jeremiah basically says is that Daniel was a eunuch along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I always get this question, it's like, what's a eunuch, okay? Because a lot of times people don't know. So my best way of answering what's a eunuch is to think of a bull versus an ox, okay? So an ox has all the strength and the power of a bull, okay? Because it's a male bovine. But the difference is it doesn't have the reproductive organs to pass on so it doesn't have the testosterone flowing through it. It's like you could never take a bull and bring it into a facility such as a county fair. But you can take an ox and you can bring him into a facility. And I always remember standing next to an ox. And it was 2,000 pounds of pure muscle, okay? But it was so calm, so tame. It had a ring around its nose, It just stood there. But you can never do that with a bull. Because that bull has that testosterone flowing through it, and it's raging. It's a raging bull, okay? And so that's what happened to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were basically, they were not able to have children, okay? And that's why the master of the eunuchs is over them. And so in that world, there were people who served in the king's palace, eunuchs who served in the king's palace. Sometimes eunuchs had very high positions and were very powerful. So that's the case with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Ashpenaz was the master of the eunuchs, and he was over them. The young men in whom there was no blemish. So again, these were young men, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and skill. They were going to be taught all the learning and the teachings of the Babylonians, and they're also known as Chaldeans. Chaldeans are like basically considered the wise men of Babylon. And so what happened is the king appointed. So if someone would like to read Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 to 7, they were given a daily provision. So basically, and this is a key part to remember, the daily provision that they were given was animals and food that were sacrificed to the Babylonian gods and goddesses. Just like in most of the markets in the time of Paul, for example, most meat was not just slaughtered; it was sacrificed to idols, and that was always the conflict in the early church: is whether you eat meat that's going to be sacrificed to idols. And that's where Paul says, it's not. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about it because if you don't believe it, you don't trust it. But that's where some people didn't want to eat any meat because it was sacrificed to idols, and there was this conflict. In the same way, in the time of Daniel, they were going to be given this food to eat, and this food that they were going to eat was going to cause them to have to eat meat and different things sacrificed to the gods and goddesses of Babylon. And so, and there was going to be for a 3-year period of time. This is a three-year training period. That's what it says for 1,000, like Cedar University, for example, has 1,000 days. So basically 1,000 days of training. So here they're going to have 3 years of training for them. I like to call it Babylonian University. So they're going to Babylonian University, and that's where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to make the difference. Now, if you go to Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So think about that. What separated Daniel from everybody else? As Daniel purposed in his heart. Because it's in our hearts we make the choices and the decisions of what we do and who we are. It's in your heart. So it was the same with Daniel. Daniel purposed in his heart. So not only is the book of Daniel powerful in its prophetic information, but it's also powerful in its life application, because we can take the illustration, the example of Daniel, and apply it in our own lives. So Daniel, I think of myself, I say, okay, it's my heart. What I decide in my heart is going to determine the course of my life. I can't blame anybody else but myself. I have to take full responsibility for my choices and for my actions, for what I'm willing to do in my heart. And so that's where God gives an example. To me, Daniel's always a poster child. I mean, imagine a 14-year-old child being taken thousands of, because he had to traipse all the way up the Euphrates River, all the way down into Babylon, area completely foreign to him, 14 years old, and like most people fail, most people fall, they give up. How would you expect this 14-year-old kid to be willing to go through all this? So this is where it's interesting, because we look at Daniel and it says Daniel purposed in his heart. So he had to make a choice. And then later on in Daniel chapter 10, it tells us about this event, because the angel, when Daniel's 80 some years old, maybe 83, 84 years old, the angel comes to Daniel and he says, Daniel, from the first day that you set your heart to understand and know your God, your words were heard. And it doesn't end with Daniel. It ends, the same thing applies to us. The first day that you and I set our hearts to understand and know God and to do his will, God hears our words. So along with Daniel, he had 3 friends, okay? So now notice, and look at verse 9, how God responds to Daniel's purpose and prayer. In verse 9 it says, now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. So the first point is that Daniel purposed in his heart, and then once Daniel purposed in his heart, what happened? God moved the chief of the eunuchs to give Daniel favor. It's the same, that's a life principle, that's a scriptural life principle today. Once you and I purpose in our hearts to do something, God will move things to give us that favor. And that's what he's doing to Daniel. God brought Daniel into favor and the goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Then verse 10 it says, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age, and then would endanger my head before the king? Because it says Daniel purposed in his heart, like basically Daniel said, I don't want to eat this food. He goes, I just want to drink water and seeds and pulse, okay? I don't want to eat this food. And so he made a request to the king. He stepped out, okay? Daniel stepped out, and then God brings favor. Then notice what we have. Then we have, in verse 10, we have some opposition. And a lot of times, people, when they have opposition, what do? They fold. Like, because we don't want to have opposition. We want everything like okay, God, Daniel purpose in his heart. God brought him in favor. Then the next thing is, the chief of the eunuchs is afraid. He's afraid that he's going to get in trouble, okay? And so as a result of being afraid, he responds accordingly. So we see this kind of principle throughout Scripture. If you look on page 6 of the handout, God over and over again operates this way, okay? Abel, for example. Abel and his brother, Cain, it says Abel offered a better sacrifice. Now, no one was forcing Abel to offer, but Abel from his heart offered a better sacrifice. And so what happened is God respected his offering. That was a heart decision. Abel could have, because there was Cain and there was Abel. And Cain basically, okay, my brother's giving a sacrifice, I got to give a sacrifice also. And so it wasn't a good sacrifice. It was one, I got to do it also. And so then God responded accordingly. God basically rejected Cain's offering, but Abel's offering he accepted. So the same thing with Noah. It says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, it says that Noah trusted God and he was a just man in a world filled with sin. And so as a result, God saved Noah from the flood. We saw Abraham. Abraham was in the city of Haran. He went there from Ur of the Chaldees with his father and his nephew Lot. And then from Haran, he left, okay? He left his father's house and went to Moriah, which is where Jerusalem is. And God established his offspring forever. So Joseph, we see in Genesis 38, verse 9, Joseph resisted Potiphar's wife. I mean, all these things were choice. Like he could have not resisted Potiphar's wife, okay? But he resisted Potiphar's wife, and God then makes him basically a prince of Egypt. Moses chose to leave Egypt. He chose to leave the house of Pharaoh, not serve under the house of Pharaoh, and become basically a shepherd in the land of Midian for 40 years, because he left Egypt when he was 40. He was 40 years. So, but why? Why did he do that? Because he looked forward to the kingdom of God. So these are all choices. And then Joshua believed God could deliver Israel. Remember, they go in the land, they were spies in the land, and then 10 of the spies, oh, it's so bad, there's no way. But Joshua and Caleb, they believed God. And as a result, they were the only two of the older generation to enter the promised land. And then David slew Goliath because he felt he had insulted God. So all these are the same principles. It's a principle of being able to make the choice, to follow through on that choice. So Daniel's getting resistance from the chief of the eunuchs, okay? He says, oh, if I give you this, you're going to look bad and I'm going to be killed. So could Daniel say, well, I tried, Lord, I tried, and it's not happening. But Daniel goes, no. He says, and you're going to see that Daniel's a prayer warrior. And this is a principle. So in verse 11, it says, so Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, okay? So the chief of the eunuchs had more than just Daniel. He had someone else, kind of like his steward that was over. So Daniel said, okay. He goes, please, test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. He goes, that's all. He goes, just test us. We don't want to eat the food sacrificed to idols. And so what did the steward say? Again, God, we see the physical event, but there's a spiritual event that's taking place. So God is allowing Daniel to keep going. He's asking now the steward, okay? He goes, test us. He's putting the option before him. He goes in verse 13, it says, then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies as you see fit. So deal with your servants. So Daniel is putting a test before someone else, okay? So we have the chief of the eunuchs, who at first says, no, I can't allow you to not eat the meat sacrificed to the idols. You have to eat it. And so then Daniel then talks to the steward. He says, test us. 10 days. Give us a 10-day test. And so, and just test us at the end of 10 days if we look better or worse for the test. So in verse 14, it says, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. So just so everybody understands, there were more people than Daniel who were probably taken into Babylonian captivity in 605 BC. But what separated Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from these is one, they formed a group. They formed a team. Like they were a team together. And that's another illustration of life principles, is like to be around a fellow group of believers. That's where church is so important, because it's a group, the church's job is to equip the saints, okay? So you're around a fellow group. It's so very important to get kids, young people into church so they can be around those who can be equipped. They could be around people their own age, their own community, so they can work together. So that's the first principle. Then they prayed together. We're going to see over and over again how Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they pray together. They seek God's will together. And here they probably prayed before they approached the steward that was put over them. And so what happens at the end of 10 days, in verse 15, it says, at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. And thus the steward took away their portion of the delicacies, the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Now, why is this important? Because, again, what's taking place here? We see the physical scene. The physical scene is that Daniel's taken from Jerusalem. He's taken to a foreign land. That's the physical scene. They asked to eat the vegetables, so they don't have to eat the meat sacrificed to idols. And then we see different levels of conflict there. But in the end, God answers their prayer, and the steward takes away the portion of the delicacies of the wine and the drink that they gave, and gave them vegetables, because the vegetables were considered low-grade food. It wasn't important to sacrifice. You didn't really offer sacrifices of vegetables. So it was like cleansed. It was clean for them to eat. Now, that brings us to the last part of chapter 1, and here it says in verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature, wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. That's the corollary here. That's in response to the test that they went through at the beginning. So this is the thing, is that God allows us to go through tests in life. And it's like how we respond to tests are going to determine how our journey goes. If we fail, I know myself, there's been many times in my life that I've failed spiritually. And my course could be here or it could be here, okay? But every time I fail, I learn from the failure, okay? And I try to grow from the failure. So here, for example, we get a short picture from this scene here. In this scene, for example, God, it tells us that in verse 17, it says, God gave them knowledge. God is responding to their prayer that they purposed in their heart that they might not defile themselves. In response to that, God blessed them and rewarded them with giving them knowledge. And their knowledge was not only in the Bible, but it was also in the Babylonian knowledge. So Daniel excelled, okay? Just like we live in a secular world. And you and I, as believers in a secular world, we have to know history. We have to know the world we're living in. We have to know the circumstances of the world we're living in. And so, because we use that to help people who are lost find the Lord. In the same way, Daniel is elevated to prime minister, both under the Babylonians and both under the Persians. So God is elevating Daniel. God is putting Daniel in that position, but God is actually responding to Daniel's heart, because Daniel purposed in his heart that he might not defile himself. and along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who also purposed in their heart. Now in verse 13, it says, now at the end of days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. This is 3 years later, remember? And the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. So God elevates them and he puts them in that position. It's the same today. When you know the Lord and you serve the Lord and you put the Lord first, God's going to elevate you. So in verse 20 we read, verses 20 and 27, it says, now in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, astrologers who were in his realm. So God elevates them and God makes them a counterpoint to the secular world in Daniel's day. Well, the secular world being the pagan world in Daniel's day. So God elevated. So, I mean, we could see some of this example today, for example, where, recently a lot of college football players and even NFL players, they're believers. They're quarterbacks and they're believers and they're all elevating the Lord. They're all talking about the Lord. Is that an accident? No. God will intentionally elevate people to reflect the light in a fallen world. It's the same in Daniel's day. God specifically takes Daniel and he pulls Daniel out of the world, of the pagan world, and he elevates Daniel, that Daniel might be a light to the darkness around him. Same with Joseph. Joseph was elevated. He became prime minister in in Egypt, okay? So in the same way, Daniel's elevated. And that's why it says in verse 21, it says, thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, King Cyrus is not a Babylonian, he's a Persian. And so that's kind of like, it gives you the span. In that very first chapter, it's giving you the span of Daniel's prophetic timeline. So in 605, he's taken captive into Babylon. And in and then all the way to verse 21, it says, and Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Okay, who is King Cyrus? King Cyrus was the Persian king who defeats the Babylonians, who comes to power about 539 BC. So it's giving you a timeline from the first year to the time of Cyrus the Great. So that's the timeline that Daniel's going to be prophesying through.